In this short lecture, I will introduce some of the basic or fundamental features of organizational structure. As this quote by Bernstein and Noria says, organizational structure is simply the pattern of organizational roles, relationships, and procedures that enable coordination. So the core thing that we're trying to achieve with organizational structure is the coordination of activities. The reason we have organizations, or the reason we organize, is that we can accomplish more in organizations, or things that are perhaps more efficient in organizations than we can outside of them, and that an organization is a more effective way to coordinate activities than trying to do that without the benefit of an organization. So when we think of structure in organizations, if we think about the roles, so how, in a moment we'll talk about how work and jobs are organized, how decisions are made about how those are coordinated. Structure itself affects a number of things in organizations, including how efficient we are. So some decisions about structure will make certain activities easier and enable efficiency, and other things will get in the way of that. It also affects responsiveness, so how quickly we can react to situations will be affected by the way organizations are designed or put together. The extent to which organizations adapt or can change or innovate will be affected. We'll talk about in just a little bit that structure creates rigidity and implies a certain rigidity. So if things are changing and the demands of what we need to do as an organization change, it may influence our ability to adapt to those demands. We talked in the other short lecture about formal control and organizational design, about the contingency theory, and the idea that an organization's structure needs to match the external environment demands. And finally, it affects integrity in the sense of, can we deliver things in a consistent way? Can we produce what we expect to produce, is how I would characterize the idea of integrity with respect to how organizational structure affects us. And that is the tension between differentiation and integration. And we differentiate, or we group things together in organizations. We allocate work into a division of labor. And the most basic unit of division of labor that we'll talk about in just a moment is a job. And so we think about what should be in a job and why should that be contained in a separate unit, typically attached to an individual, but we could talk about cases under which a job is not identical with an individual. Once we move up a level from division of labor around jobs, we can think about units or departments. And that's what differentiation starts to pull into, which is how should groups of jobs and groups of activities be put together in organizations, whether that's physically located or through the role of rules or how workflows operate, what is put together in terms of this differentiation. So we separate groups. So we might separate functions, for example. We may have groups organized around functions like finance or marketing or manufacturing or distribution. And that would be ways that we would differentiate work and group-like kinds of activities together. The moment we engage in differentiation, we, by definition, create boundaries between certain kinds of activities and other kinds of activities. And this is where the famous metaphor of a silo comes from, that once we put people together in an activity and we start to focus their attention using things like budgets or using things like incentives or controls, authority, we begin to have people focus more on what's going on internal to that group versus externally, and make it more difficult to coordinate across those boundaries. So that necessitates the consideration of what's called strategic linking or integration. And how is it that we're going to coordinate across these roles? How do we coordinate across jobs? How do we coordinate across units? How do we coordinate across functions? How do we coordinate across businesses? And those add challenges to identify where coordination is necessary, where the barriers to coordination are likely to occur, and all coordination adds cost in terms of time, attention, money and other problems in organizations. So we necessarily need to group things together, but we create boundaries that create the need to determine how we're going to integrate across those different groupings. So once we address the general tension, this fundamental trade-off between differentiation and integration, then we can think about what the overall functions of structure are. What do they offer? What are the tools of structure? And what are some of the challenges or trade-offs associated with each of these 4 functions of structure? So if we first move into the idea of division of labor, this just reflects the fact that a single person can't know or do everything, particularly in the kind of complex organizations in which we live today, although from my little example of a family, most of us recognize too that usually a single family member doesn't necessarily know everything that's happening in the family or everything that needs to get done in the family. So some means of sharing or coordination, for example, the calendar I shared a little bit earlier, might be necessary to create integration across activities. So the division of labor recognizes that no people can do everything needed, and leaders must make decisions about how work is going to be divided up and grouped. And again, just like differentiation and integration, a key trade-off here is that the more differentiated things are, the more specialized things are. And we can engage in specialization in organizations that's both vertical, so those are types of authority differentiation and levels of jobs in organizations. And usually vertical specialization is associated with differences in levels of strategic thinking versus operational thinking or activities, and may have implications around decision rights that we'll come back to in just a minute. But specialization serves to focus attention. So if a job is very specialized, people can invest in skills and become very, very expert at that particular job or set of small, narrow skills. And they permit kind of ready attention to differentiation or development of skills and standards. So if we think about an organization that has very specifically defined types of engineers, and people are hired into those categories of engineers, and they have to have very specific educational backgrounds and training requirements or licenses around those skills, then we can have people learn from others who have deeper sets of skills in that area, and we can develop deep expertise inside of that differentiated or specialized skill set. The challenge is that the more narrow that jobs become, the more specialized they are, we have some risk that we now have to coordinate across people, not just departments, and that we know from our work on teamwork, which we'll spend some time on in class as well, that people have a hard time talking to and understanding the knowledge and expertise of people who are trained very differently from themselves, have very different work processes than themselves. So a challenge is that the more specialized jobs we get, we actually increase the demands of coordination across individuals, and we increase the need for things like cross-functional or multidisciplinary teams, which have their own sets of challenges in terms of people being able to collaborate with each other, given their very different worldviews and training and background and history. And finally, highly specialized jobs can run the risk of becoming monotonous or boring jobs because they have very narrow sets of activities and oftentimes end up being more repetitive. So we know that there could be a motivational hit if jobs become too narrow or too specialized. So there is a trade-off in terms of division of labor, in terms of whether we want highly specialized jobs or very open, ambiguous, adaptable, and changing jobs. And we'll see a little bit more of how that works in the case that we talk about for this week. So I think it's just interesting to talk a little bit about jobs as an aside here, because they're the fundamental building block of all organizational structure. Not that we necessarily think about building from the bottom up all the time. We don't necessarily start with jobs and think about how we bundle upward. Oftentimes, especially in the large existing old organizations many of us work in, the organizational structure seems pretty firm from the top down in terms of how the leadership is structured, how the different groupings For example, in the university, we're structured into colleges, and the Carlson School is a college in itself, but inside of that, we're structured into departments that are organized mostly around general function areas. So we are grouped by similarity of the type of topics we work on, whether that's management and people, or finance, or accounting, or marketing, for example. So we oftentimes think about those larger superstructures and then maybe think about where jobs fit inside of those. But another way to think about it is we have jobs, we have activities that need to get done, and how should those be best arranged in the organization. And jobs are really just nothing more than bundles of tasks that are performed by employees, and they're usually attached to some kind of administrative job title. And jobs connect individuals to organizations. So when we think about being hired in an organization, we're usually hired to come in for a job, although we can probably think of situations where organizations bring in high quality talent that they don't, at the point of recruitment, know exactly where they're going to place them. But more often than not, we enter organizations targeted as someone who has the skills, human capital, social capital, to be able to perform a set of activities that are jobs. So we want to think about how tasks get allocated into and across jobs. And if you haven't thought about that very much, it's probably worthwhile to spend a little bit of time thinking about what makes up a job and who decides what a job entails, and is there any careful consideration or evidence-based thinking around what should be in a job, what's a big enough job, what's too complex a job, how do we make those decisions? And there are lots of different things we could think about, and in fact entire areas of study that we could go into. But for now, I think it's just worth your while to maybe stop, pause for a minute, and think about that. Think about, what is your job and what's in it and what's not in it? How clearly defined is that? Is there a job description that makes sense associated with your job? Is your job description accurate? You could maybe go back and take a look at your job description if it's available, and see if you agree how much it actually covers what you do on a day-to-day basis. And then think a little bit about the implications if our job descriptions and recruiting are not really aligned with what actually gets done inside of an organization. And that starts to begin to push at the idea that structure is something that leaders have a lot of control over, or are necessarily thinking about on a detailed basis, on a regular basis. It just simply brings up the point that when we talk about job design, it really kind of implies that there's sort of a well-ordered, deliberate, theoretically driven process, that there's some kind of architect or inventor, and that jobs are controlled by these designers or managers. Again, we can talk a little bit about in class to see the variation in what you discover if you think about your jobs, your job descriptions, the role you've played in designing jobs or identifying the need for new jobs or new roles. But it's important to think a little bit about how jobs get created. So you can ask yourself, how are jobs created? And there actually is some really interesting research about this, that we like to think, again, that we are rational and that organizations are rational places. We like to think about this machine metaphor of jobs that are carefully designed and put together and make sense in a bundle. But again, if we spend too much time thinking about this at all, we realize there's a lot of situations where that rational machine-based view is violated. So there's research that suggests that jobs come about from a lot of sometimes irrational ways. So sometimes there's these external constraints or external environmental demands. We know from contingency theory that the external environment affects organization structure and design, and it affects jobs too. So sometimes there are what we might think of as social movements. So if we think about over time how certain things come up in the media, how certain things go through fads. Many of our organizations had or may still have, for example, a chief knowledge officer. So that could have been a trend or a movement within the way that managerial thinking has happened over time. The social movement idea can also be in reaction to some kind of problem. So we've had some conversations in class about the Me Too movement. We've had discussions about implicit bias and diversity and problems trying to overcome bias in our organizations. So we may see these trends happening, that there are big social movements going on with concerns about bias and discrimination. And as a result, we may end up seeing entirely new kinds of jobs that pop up around these questions around diversity or discrimination over time. We can also see things associated with corporate social responsibility that's been sort of a hot trend over the last years. And one of the things that's sort of interesting is that sometimes when we think about this idea of social movements or exposure to ideas, there's sort of a copying that happens. I'm not going to write this very well, but sort of a copycat that is an irrational. It is an irrational way to come up with jobs, because if we're only adding certain roles because we see, for example, competitors or other industry organizations putting those jobs into place, and we just want to feel like we're legitimate, or that we can't be on the same playing field if we don't have those jobs or those roles, then we might be doing that for an irrational reason, and a reason that doesn't really line up with the strategic demands of our organization, but are more about trying to look good or trying to mimic other organizations. So jobs can come about because we actually need them, or jobs can come about because we look around and see that it seems like other successful organizations have those divisions or those titles or those jobs, and then we might copy those and include them in our organization, whether or not we need them. Another way that jobs can arise in organizations come from internal constraints. And these could be things including that job holders themselves, they mold the job to fit their personal preference. And there's a whole world around the whole idea of job crafting from your standpoint as an employee, that you can act to create a job that builds on your strengths and magnifies your strengths. And if we think about the Best Workplaces article, that's what we're in some ways instructed to do, is try to find ways to draw out the strengths of employees. But what it means is that we end up oftentimes ending up with what are called idiosyncratic jobs that are kind of built around people, or that people are engaging in power dynamics and building jobs that offer them power and make it difficult for them to be replaced, for example. And what happens is over time, sometimes those incumbents leave and organizations end up with a variety of sort of strange jobs that don't make a lot of sense if you looked at that just kind of from an impartial, rational kind of designer standpoint. So the kind of core takeaway from here is that we need to stop and reflect a little bit and recognize the idea that we think of organizational design and structure as this very rational, intentional job of manager or leader as an architect. But in fact, if we make sure we think about the political organization, if we think about the external environment driving the need to add certain types of jobs that we wouldn't otherwise have, we end up with a lot of variety of jobs and structures that may not actually be that helpful or productive for our organization, or maybe at first they're not and they grow into that role over time. But in some ways, this can get in the way of effective work as well if we have a variety of jobs that don't really make sense in terms of how they're bundled together, who's holding them, what's a big enough job versus a small enough job for a person to manage, what's a job that's specialized enough to become a master at, but not too specialized to lose the sense of meaning or growth in the process. These are all considerations to think about making effective organizations using organizational design and structure. So once we make decisions about differentiating or grouping the organization into different kinds of like activities or activities around some focus, we end up requiring the need to coordinate, whether that's among individuals who have different jobs or whether that's among departments or functions in the organization. So we need to add so-called vertical or lateral mechanisms. So vertical up the chain, what are those? Are those sort of reporting relationships? Are those expectations about budgeting, reporting, or accounting? Horizontally, we might need to have things like teams or other kinds of coordination mechanisms. And one of the big things is it's costly. So the more that we create these differentiating groups, the more we actually have to engage in coordination activities, and it's costly. So just for instance, even just having meetings takes a lot of time away from people's direct productivity. So there's a variety of different kinds of coordination options. These are things that were brought up in the Gold and Campbell article, so I recommend that you just review these and just understand how these can actually end up producing coordination. So, for example, in a shared or pooled negotiation, if you are trying to go out to a supplier as an organization, what you might need to recognize in terms of coordination is that multiple parts of your organization may need things from that supplier. And if you individually go to the supplier, the organization may lose efficiency because it may not get the best pricing if different divisions or different product groups are independently going. So somehow the organization needs to understand where those dependencies are and then produce some kind of coordination mechanism to help alleviate the fact that you've differentiated and have several areas that need to go talk to that single supplier. The same thing can happen in terms of facing customers and trying to make sure that you don't have 5 or 6 parts of your organization going into the same customer, which can both irritate them but also lose some opportunity for example, a market advantage or a parent advantage that the Gold and Campbell article talk about. So once we think about differentiation and division of labor, the next major structural feature or tool are decision rights. And this is simply that structure is where the idea of who makes decisions is specified. So, and there's tension because sometimes maybe the manufacturing manager wants to make decisions about certain features, or an engineer wants to make certain decisions about features, but marketing or sales may also feel like they have a right to weigh into that. And it may be difficult to understand whose decisions should take priority depending upon the strategy the organization is trying to pursue and those kinds of things, which is why we sometimes end up, as we'll see in a little bit, with organizational designs like matrices or the matrix, where we can try to have teams that bring together the different areas that might have a stake in a decision and try to have them participate in that decision. So we have to think about goal congruence and the incentives that we're giving to people so that their decisions and decision outcomes become aligned. And then one of the other important decisions around structure comes to the point about organizational boundaries. And this can be linked to things like transaction cost economics of Oliver Williamson and others, which we kind of boil down to what we think of as a make or buy decision. And so this question is, what activities should occur inside the boundary of the organization and what should occur outside? So in the German immersion school, I mentioned that I've been a school board member for. One of the things that a school like that has to decide is for example, its accounting and financial services functions. And in that situation, the school from its beginning purchased those services from outside. And it made sense in the long run to do that because the school is small and trying to have one staff person may not have been a very efficient, costly cost savings way to manage that. And then the idea of trying to hire someone who might have the expertise to really understand school finance and stay on top of that was pretty difficult. And so instead it made sense from an organizational standpoint that we could access those services and that knowledge both more efficiently and effectively by contracting with an external partner. So these kinds of decisions need to be made on a regular basis, but they also generate, again, additional coordination challenges. So the moment there's some set of activities that we're doing that we're getting outside the boundary, we now have other risks that certain knowledge can leak when we try to go back out to those people. If we think about the network examples we talked about, some of our expertise could leak across that boundary and get in the hands of people we don't want it to. We may have to actually have specialized jobs right at the border to coordinate and work with those external organizations or jobs or sources. So One of the things we can talk a little bit more about in class is whether or not we are accurately costing out the decision to make or buy, and if we're actually including the intangible coordination losses and costs that take place when we choose to move certain activities outside of the organizational boundary. So one of the big things we have to decide when we think about differentiation and integration are these sort of generic forms of structuring. And in the note on organizational structure, these were brought up. So you have a lot of depth there to take a look at, but I want to just quickly point out that the most traditional ways that we think of organizational structure are around these so-called management-centric views, where managers or leaders define the organizational structure. And there's four most common approaches to these management-centric or kind of classic organizational designs. The first one is designing your organization around expertise or function. This is the classic silo, where we think about the organization built around functions like marketing, sales, finance, manufacturing, or in the case of the Carlson School and a business school, we're around departments like people, work and organizations, strategy and entrepreneurship, marketing, etc. So those are built around the fact that the people in the groupings share the same general job functions in the organization. The next set are to, instead of organize around function or expertise, to organize around products or perhaps around geography or customers. These might be considered divisional designs. And some of the trade-offs around these designs are that sometimes we have redundancy, so that if we have a geographic grouping in the world that also has its own marketing function, we have another geographic grouping in another part of the world that has its marketing function, we now may have actually more marketing resources than we need because they're duplicated around the world. So this is where we sometimes see the pulling out of certain functions as shared services. And that can be a role of the so-called parenting advantage in Gould and Campbell. So what is the good of having different businesses or different geographies under one large corporation? Why are they bundled together and owned by the same company? Sometimes it's because we can serve with certain functions across those businesses a more efficient way and do things more effectively than we could if those were separate organizations or separate divisions or separate functions. And then finally, the one that most of us in large organizations are aware of is the so-called hybrid or matrix organization. And these organizations are designed to take the best of the cost savings and specialization of a functional design, but lay over it permanent or semi-permanent product teams or horizontal coordination functions or structures to allow that kind of across function, across product, across divisions, activities like sharing knowledge or leveraging inventions or innovation across different groups. And the big challenge from the hybrid designs like the matrix are that there are challenges for the individuals there because they tend to have to serve both their functional boss and pyramid or silo and their product bosses, and unless that compensation or incentive or goal setting structure is aligned very carefully, people can end up feeling like they're pulled in multiple directions and it's not clear how they should put their effort or attention in toward what efforts. So sometimes the matrix can provide some advantages but also create coordination costs because it's difficult to align the vertical and these horizontal structures inside of them. So Bernstein and Noria also talk about a change to what some people call employee-centric models, where instead of designing the structure, so by that I mean instead of designing the boxes and the lines and the arrows and the traditional variation in the strategic grouping or differentiation of the organization, in employee-centric models, leaders define the so-called structuring processes. So they decide things like how decision-making should occur, who makes the choice about when someone needs to be involved and who gets involved, what does accountability look like in this organization, and how do you create that on the fly. And some of these employee-centric designs include team-based designs or network designs, or kind of famously the holacracy that is written a lot about with Zappos. So if you haven't read very much about that, I think the design note goes into some detail about Zappos, and you can search it, and there's a lot of very interesting things written about it. We can pick this apart a little bit because I think we'll be able to discuss it with respect to the case in our class discussion about the pros and cons of management-centric versus employee-centric designs. And there are some people who feel like these employee-centric or even crowd-centric designs are the wave of the future, but we can debate that a little bit more in person. And finally, kind of maybe the most cutting-edge idea, the crowd-centric designs, where there's a sort of self-managed defining of roles. And this is in examples of Wikipedia or other open source software or so-called purpose-driven organizations. These are very interesting. I think we don't traditionally see them in our for-profit, product-driven sectors. They came up when we looked at the Pink Drive video a little bit in terms of attracting people to some kind of common role or common purpose, and then an organization of sorts emerges around that. A final little note, I think we'll talk about these more in class, is that new may not be so new, that there have been people who've been going back in history and reading some of the writings of early organizational scholars, including Mary Parker Follett, who was a very early female scholar on this topic, who already in her book in the 20s was writing about this idea that organizations might be more effective if they organize around expertise, and people who drive decision making and drive the organization process should be experts, not necessarily people at the top of the hierarchy. So just food for thought that, again, some of these new ideas in some ways are not quite so new, but maybe they're being rediscovered and reimagined based on the enablement of technology and other things that are happening in this century. So back to the idea, remember the fundamental tension in organizational structure is differentiation and integration. And so another set of decisions that leaders need to make when they're considering organizational design is that they have to think about strategic linking. And this is similar to those coordination mechanisms brought up in the Gould and Campbell article. But basically, once we differentiate work and figure out our decision rights, then we have to define reporting structures. We might create different kinds of liaison roles or integrator roles. So people who sit across or sit in on meetings and they're not maybe directly in authority, but they're there so that they can carry information back. In the business school, we have a number of different elected committees where members may sit on different groups that are making decisions about products or programs like the MBA program or our specialized master's programs, and we have representatives sitting there. They may not have decision rights. They may be there for sort of informational purposes, with the idea in mind that they can go back to their departments and make sure that there's this liaison role to understand and recognize the emergence of different things that are happening in the organization. We also may have information systems in organizations where you can access and understand what's going on, what's being developed in a different part of the country, whether or not there's been some testing or innovation that you could access someplace else and bring around. And then just the alignment of planning processes themselves can bring people together in sort of formal planning to understand what are the questions going forward, what are the insights, and how do I carry that back to my particular organizational unit or part. And then the final thing we need to think about are the organizational alignment mechanisms. So we need to think about our performance measurement systems. So back to that point earlier about decision rights, if we think about the engineering staff making decisions about product specs versus what the sales staff or marketing staff wants to have, we need to think about how are we aligning that in terms of what's the outcome the organization's desiring. Are we looking for cost savings or cost reduction? Are we looking for durability? Are we looking for innovation? What are the things that we want to have happen through the coordination of efforts across those different parts of the organization? We need to think about rewards and incentives so that we don't have one part of the organization driving toward one kind of outcome, and then based on the gap between those differentiated groups, there's another group going in opposite directions. We have to think about things like our budget resource allocation, and are we actually providing enough resources to allow or enable different parts of the organization to excel, or the coordination and integration efforts or costs to be supported to make sure that we actually get the action and behavior out of the organization we need. HR development, are we hiring the right people? Are we putting in place the kind of personnel development so that we're ready for what we need? Golden Campbell talked about the people test. So we can have all sorts of grand ideas about a new structure that we're going to have, but if the people that we have currently working in the organization, or if the recruiting and development system of our organization doesn't support the new goals or the new plans of a new structure, then we are not likely to succeed. So redesigning and restructuring without considering re-engineering these alignment features will just be a recipe for failure. So again, we have to think about all of these together as a bundle, and how maybe some legacy things that we had going on in terms of coordination mechanisms or alignment mechanisms may not support our new directions. And ultimately, we need to remember that there's a downside to every single structure. So, for instance, this chart summarizes a little bit of the material from the Bernstein and Noria article, that the functional structure of an organization offers a lot of support for efficiency and maybe stability, and lets us be very good at repeating things and having depth of expertise in functional areas. But because those departments are siloed, and because it's sometimes very difficult to coordinate or learn across those functions, even with the use of teaming across the functions, these functions or structures may be slower to adapt than other kinds of organizations. We already talked a little bit about in divisional structures. We lose these economies of scale because we sometimes repeat functions and support across multiple divisions in the organization. And we sometimes can get to be costly, somewhat bloated structure. And uncertainty is high across those divisions, because sometimes the strategies of one division are not very compatible with the strategies of another division, and the design may in some ways create some friction about that. Matrix structures are very responsive strategies, and they also allow the benefits of the functional design to still exist in an organization in terms of recruitment, training, advancement, but then the overlay of horizontal permanent structures like product teams allow for a more permanent support of the horizontal coordination. But there's oftentimes conflicts then between the functional parts of the organization and the product groups, for example. And unless we have an effective way to resolve those conflicts, we may have the organization starting to move in multiple directions or for multiple purposes. And then finally are these so-called new, either employee-centric or crowd-centric designs. We see these occurring in kind of new industries. We see them occurring in high-velocity environments where innovation is a premium. But it may, end up being some redundancy. We may end up not having a whole lot of control over who's hired. We may have very idiosyncratic jobs, such that if people leave, it's very difficult to rehire or refill those positions. And there's at least some, feeling that maybe going back to Google and Project Oxygen, that as these organizations grow and mature and become sometimes very large, it's difficult to know how well these more employee-centric or crowd-centric designs work in large organizations. Though we will dig a little bit into one case, and you may want to just do a little bit of searching on your own to look at it, about Gore, W.H. Gore, which is a very interesting organization. It's a very large chemical-based company that actually is a team-based organization and is essentially a flat organization. So it is possible, but I would have to say that we're going to link it up very closely with the idea of informal control and culture. And it's true that when we get to more employee-based or employee-centric cultures or crowd-based cultures, the role of informal control becomes much more important. And that is going to go back to power and influence processes, networks, And as we see also this week in terms of culture and how identity and meaning and purpose might then be the organizing principles instead of the idea of function or differentiation or strategy. And maybe those meet up someplace, but the relative emphasis on one or the other is going to vary across these more managerial-centric designs versus employee and crowd-centric designs. So thanks for hanging in there. This is some content that by doing this ahead of time will free us up to more in-depth discussion of the two cases to look at formal and informal structure and control coming up this week. Thanks.